We're back, brother, and once again brought to you by PaintballToTheEnd.com.
To 10-Minute Marks, episode number 37. I am Jeff.
And I'm Paul, and today we've got kind of a special episode. One I've actually wanted to do for a little bit of time now. We're going to go through our top 3 best Intercontinental Champions in history. And actually the Intercontinental Championship belt is my favorite title ever since I was a little kid watching wrestling. So, anyhow.
My number 3 pick. My number 2 and number 1 were pretty easy, but number 3 is hard. You have Jericho, Triple H, The Rock, Stone Cold. I actually thought maybe making it a tie between The Rock, Stone Cold, Triple H, and Owen Hart for that time between 98 and 99 when they just kept swap-swapping back. But I figured I had to go with one person, and that one person for number 3 for me is Randy Savage, barely beating out Chris Jericho. And I just think his 1 year and 2 month run as champion and right before WrestleMania 3 was awesome. I think that deserved, I like quality of reign as opposed to quantity of the reigns. So that's why I put Randy Savage in as number 3. And plus the way him and Ricky Steamboat fought for the title really elevated the title to almost as important as the world title, if not more important, the way they battled out for it. And it really gave the belt a stable, solid foundation to build upon to lead to other superstars' reigns.
Before I go with my number 3, my honorable mentions, I really wanted to put Shelton Benjamin at 3. I was also tempted to put Honky Tonk Man, even though that was a little bit before my time. And I was never a huge fan of his, but I respect the fact that he set the bar for the reigns that followed him, because he had it for over a year, and I think he still has the longest reign. Mm-hmm. But my number 3 would also be Randy Savage, partially because 1, I love Randy Savage, but 2, he was a really good heel during that period, and looking back at the matches, and the fact that he had that monumental match with Ricky Steamboat, and they went nuts when Steamboat won.
Yep.
I mean, Savage made they made each other look good, but Savage made Steamboat look good. And to have that longer reign that he had, and then finally losing it, that's something I wish today's wrestling would have.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Totally agree.
Agree 316.
Yes, agree 316. Yeah, that's one of those, kind of off the subject a little bit, Eric Bischoff made a comment that wrestling should have less pay-per-views, and this was back during the time of less pay-per-views. And I really agree with Mr. Bischoff on that one. Less is more in that case. My number 2 would be the Honky Tonk Man. Mainly because he had the longest reign as Intercontinental Champion, plus he was the second most hated Intercontinental Champion of all time, behind my number 1. And the level of competition for both my number 2 and my number 1 was astronomical back then. I mean, they had such great talent in the WWE in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, they had to fight off Brutus Beefcake, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, who wasn't the most talented, but he was well over. I mean, very over with the fans. He eventually had to fight off the Ultimate Warrior and lost, but, whatever. You also still had Randy Savage back then. You had monumental talent back then, and that's why I put Honky Tonk, especially with the length of his reign, at number 2.
My number 2 and number 1 was kind of hard, particularly because I had to kind of fight nostalgia for objectivity, but my number 2 would have to be Chris Jericho. And although we're going to get to number 1, but although number 1 had a better round of opponents, Jericho still had a decent few runs, even though a couple of them were short, like with RVD, for example. But he had great matches with, Edge, Chris Benoit, Rob Van Dam, Christian. He had that feud with Shelton Benjamin that got Shelton Benjamin over. Jeff Hardy, I think that was the last belt he beat for the Intercontinental belt. And of course, that allowed him to propel and to become the first undisputed champion and so forth. But that era of wrestling was among my favorite eras. And some of those matches were phenomenal. Even though I would object to some of the short reigns, which were common in the Attitude Era. And that's probably what prohibits me from putting him at 1. So, yeah, sorry, Chris, I love you and everything, but I didn't put you at number 1. But he'd be number 2, and also because he's had the most title reigns of anybody. He's had it I think he's had it 8 times now, which at 7 he beat Jarrett's record. So he basically just beat it again at 8. But.
And who here objects to him beating Jeff Jarrett's record? Not me.
Not me.
My number 1 Intercontinental Champion of all time. I bought this guy's DVD not too long ago, and this is the main reason I thought of this subject, but it has to be Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig. I mean, the level of competition he had to sustain the belt. He won it from Tito Santana in a classic match.
Yeah.
Oh my God, and he defended against Tito, and those matches were just as great. You had great heels like Rick Martel, who was super hated, who I would have loved to see them two in the ring together. Especially both of them being former AWA World Champions.
Oh, yeah. A lot of history there.
A lot of history. You had the previously mentioned Bruce Beefcake, who was hot on his heels. You had guys like the Earthquake, again, Hacksaw Jim Duggan. I mean, Big Boss Man, he defended it against. I mean, you had a lot of talent around that could have been Intercontinental Champion. If you'd have put his reign 10 years later in the Attitude Era, he wouldn't have held that belt as long because it would have just gotten passed around. That's how deep the talent was back then. It would have been like Triple H and Stone Cold and The Rock and Owen Hart in the late 90s. But the fact that he held on to that belt for as long as he did, he lost it for like 3 months to Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich. But come on, Kerry Von Erich, that's not a bad opponent to lose to. Kerry Von Erich was a legend, even back then. I mean, he was already legendary. So that wasn't exactly a bad loss. And then to lose it to Bret Hart, not exactly a bad loss either. So that's why I chose him at number 1. That he was just so hated. Mm-hmm. I mean, my God, he had the best vignettes. I mean, he was so hated, and he was just perfect.
And I have to agree with Jeff on that. I actually picked him for number 1. Mr. Perfect became a favorite of mine down the road because it was a little bit before my time, before I caught on to wrestling. And obviously Mr. Perfect was the hot heel back then. Not only was he great on promos, and he could get the crowd to hate him, he was also one of the most athletically gifted wrestlers there ever were.
Oh, yeah.
He'd be up there with Brett and Shawn. Mm-hmm. And also, like I said, in fairness to Jericho too, he had more talent to kind of, more main event style talent to work with. Maybe that's not the right phrase, but anyway.
He had a lot of people to fend off.
Yeah.
He had a lot of people that could, on any night, Vince could have said, you're good enough, you deserve the IC belt.
Yeah. And one thing that was great about Mr. Perfect too was when he was the IC champ, he'd feud with Hogan.
Right.
He'd feud with Warrior.
Right. He took the belt to a main event status, and he was one of the first. I think Ultimate Warrior was really the first to take the belt to a main event status. But Mr. Perfect picked that ball up and went with it.
Oh, yeah.
And he kept it in a main event status for the time that he was champ.
And had he not lost that belt to Kerry Von Erich during that short little period, he would have been the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion.
Yep.
I mean, and he's had awesome matches like with Tito Santana. Like he said, I would love to have seen Rick Martel. Oh, yeah. He had great matches even with Shawn. His matches with Brett are like among my top 10.
Yeah.
Especially the King of the Ring one.
Don't forget Owen. He wrestled.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
I think he wrestled Owen at WrestleMania 5 or the SummerSlam thereafter, one of those.
It was SummerSlam, I believe.
Yeah, it was SummerSlam.
And it was a great match, too.
Yep.
But, like, a guy who was well-respected and just the most hated heel, but he was such a great wrestler. And that easily, he could have been a world champion, but it never happened.
Right.
But that would be, yeah, that's the reason I picked him for number 1. I just think he was just phenomenally good.
And we believe that is the end of episode number 37. Leave your comments down at the bottom. Who do you think is the best IC champ of all time?
We'd like to post some of your comments later in a future episode.
We are going to try and do a future episode where we give you guys a list of questions to answer. Email us with them, and then we'll do an episode later on giving you the answers. Some of the emails we got from you. We're at 10minutemarks@yahoo.com, or leave comments down there, post a message, subscribe to our channel, hit us up on Twitter. There's way too much social networking going on.
Yeah.
I think we're on Facebook too.
Feels like a damn movie.
Yeah. We just take a list a mile long of stuff that we're on and stuff that, email, Facebook, Twitter.
Social networking of 100,001 volts.
1,001 websites that we are on. This is our favorite, so. But yeah, hit us up, give us some comments, let us know who you think is the greatest champ of all time, and we will read them off in future episodes. But for now, I do believe that we are done.